Lepo pozdravljeni. Danes na svojem blogu gostim posebnega gosta. Z mano je ameriški pisatelj, prevajalec, urednik in založnik Lawrence Schimel. Spoznala sva se novembra na Slovenskem knjižnem sejmu, ko jo je predstavila Barbara Pregelj, urednica Založbe Malinc. Založba Malinc je izdala dve Lawrenceovi kartonki, ki jih imam tudi tukaj. To je Zgodaj zjutraj in pa Zdaj ni čas za igro. Ob tem pa še tri naslove v obliki e-knjig, in sicer Nočem biti tukaj, Tilkin zmaj in Niga čez original. Pri založbi Škuc oziroma Alef pa je bilo prevedenih še nekaj njegovih drugih slikanic, med drugim Cecilijev zmaj, Tak kot drugi, Lužasta pot in pa Boš bral knjigo z mano. Pa še dve, ki jih jaz nimam tukaj, to se pravi Spuščanje zmajev in pa Sosedje in prijatelji. Hvala. Lawrenceve knjige so prejele tudi številna najvišja priznanja na področju otroške in mladinske književnosti, med drugim tudi Lambda Literary Award v ZDA in pa Siges Sölle za najboljšo knjigo leta v Nemčiji. Izbrane so bile tudi na seznam najodličnejših knjig za otroke z oviranostmi, ki jih podeljuje IBI, Mednarodna zveza za mladinsko književnost, ter na seznam belih vran, ki jih podeljuje Münchenska mednarodna mladinska knjižnica.
This also was a Zlata Hruška?
Okej, ja, evo, Cecilija in zmaj je pa prejela tudi še Zlato hruško pri nas v Sloveniji. Hi, Lawrence, how are you?
Okay.
Dobro. Thank you for taking your time during this Christmas, New Year's holidays. How are you doing? You've told me that you've been traveling for the past weeks or even months.
Traveling a lot. It's interesting because I don't speak Slovenian, but I could follow enough of the introduction to, I mean, obviously I know who I am, so I also know the books, I know the things. I don't know, though, that one of the things that when you introduced you introduced me as an American. I am an American. I live in Madrid, though. I've been in Spain for almost 24 years now. So, and I write in both Spanish and English. So that's something, just an interesting fact, I guess, to start with. But it's nice to be home for a little while, especially the last couple trips were disastrous in terms of delayed, cancelled, all sorts of things. So it's good to be home.
Yeah, I guess. At least for a little while.
A little while.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, Madrid and Slovenia, there are no direct flights most of the year, and so it's always a difficult trying to get to visit Slovenia. It usually connection somewhere, or fly to Venice and take a go-up-tea or something. So, but I make it when I can.
Thank you. So in your little book that you published, I get it, you give it to me when we met in the Slovenian book fair. This is intended for international rights guide. And there I read that you've written more than 100 books. And besides that, you also translated as much of them. So how can one...
150 books now. And
okay.
Maybe 130 as an author and as an anthologist. So
yeah, so how can one write so many books in a lifetime? I mean, you're relatively young still.
I'm no longer as young as I was. I'm 51, so that's a lot of years. And I don't know, I like what I do, I guess.
So have you always wanted to be a writer?
No, I wanted to be a marine biologist.
Yeah, really.
I started at university, at Yale University, as a marine biologist. The problem is that I'm deathly allergic to fish. And even though it's only to eat fish, if I touch fish and I go like this is a membrane, and I have an allergy. So I had to give up my dream. You know, my only dream was to be Jacques Cousteau. That was my only dream since I was tiny.
Wow.
And I had to give it up. And I was always reading, and I had been publishing before I got to university. So I began publishing when I was in high school, still before university. My parents had to sign the contracts because I was under 18. So I was not legally able to sign the first contract. So, and I started mostly writing fantasy and science fiction. I was reading as a teenager. That was mostly what I was reading. Although I'm an omnivorous, I still read very widely across all genres, you know, from high literature with a capital L to romance novels and mystery novels and science fiction novels. You know, I read across genres. I read fiction, poetry, essays, comic books, books for adults, books for children. You know, I think my main identity is as a reader.
Okay.
And I mean, this year I was just doing some end of the year number crunching, and I've read over 500 books this year, not including books I wrote or translated. I mean, it's a lot.
Wow. That's a lot, yeah. Because my reading, even though I'm a book blogger, it's in decline now. So I need to speed up.
It's not a question of speed; it's a question of priorities, I think. And
yeah,
so,
I know.
One thing that happened during the pandemic, when I was doom scrolling all the time, so I was, you know, looking at, you know, what horrible things are happening in the world, especially, you know, Spain was an epicenter, and so we had a very strict lockdown, and so I was very claustrophobic and very worried here. And in order, I actively stopped, you know, I would put my phone down in another room, and I didn't have attention, but I was reading a lot of poetry. I could focus for brief spans. And so I just made sure that I had poetry books in every room so that I could, anytime I noticed I was doom scrolling, I could stop and pick up a book and read. And so I've kept doing that. And so I'm continuing to, anytime I notice that I'm wasting time, I have an alert. So if I spend too much time on social media, it says, you've been online for 10 minutes. Do you want to stop? And so I put it down and I pick up a book and I read instead. So
that's a good advice, actually. Yeah, thank you.
So also, I don't have children. You know, there's a lot of distractions that that many people have. You know, I don't watch television. One nice thing. So my husband and I are both readers, and so we can both be together after dinner on the couch, each one reading his own book. But it's together time. But you know, it's not. It's still reading time. So. Yeah, so that's a good thing.
yeah.
I think also, I mean, for reading, it's important not to only read, you know, many people, I'm not saying you do, but many people only read like just before bed or something. You know, they don't give reading prime time. You know, reading is the margins of their lives. And so, you know, as I joke, you can't read all day unless you start in the morning. Otherwise, you're only reading half of the day. So, you know, if you want to read all day, you really have to make sure that you dedicate time to it and give it time to, you know, so it's just a question of juggling, you know, what are you giving time to, and can reading be more something that you appreciate? You know, I mean, I love reading. That's one of my, obviously, I mean, if I've read 500 books for pleasure this year, that's one of my main things. So
yeah. So you mentioned that you are writing in English and Spanish. Is there any special reason for that?
I mean, I live in Spain for over 24 years, as I mentioned. I express myself differently in English and Spanish. So, you know, especially when I write poetry, in Spanish we have so in English, you, in Spanish, we have much more nuance. We have tú, which is an informal and usted, which is a formal singular you, and then we have vosotros and ustedes. So I remember years ago I was in a translation workshop in I think in Dane or Pisane. I forget which time it was that I first learned this, but I learned that Slovenian has the dual, and even though neither English nor Spanish, which are the languages that I create in, ever since I learned this about Slovenian, I'm always aware when I'm writing, am I writing an intimate we, a you and I we, or am I writing a plural we, a more general? So it's, my experiences in Slovenian have influenced how I think and how I create, even in the languages that don't have the dual. Neither English nor Spanish has it, but because of my experience in Slovenia, translating into and out of, or being translated, that's changed how I think. So, my daily life is mostly in Spanish, and has been for many, many years. Most of my adult life has been in Spanish, and so I'm very comfortable in both languages, and I translate in both directions, and so in out of Spanish. So occasionally from other languages, I've translated 2 rhyming books from Portuguese into Spanish, for instance. I translated 1 book from Icelandic into Galician. So I had studied Old Norse many years ago again at university, and so Icelandic, because of the geographic isolation, is very similar linguistically. I mean, there's obviously more vocabulary, so I have to look up more in the dictionary, but the basic grammatical rules are very similar still to the Old Icelandic that I studied. So, because I started in high school also, I learned Latin and Homeric Greek. And so dead languages, so I learned translation from languages that I didn't speak. And so I'm used to translating, I have experience from a literary translation as a text-to-text thing, as opposed to only the translation of as living culture, if that makes sense.
Have you ever tried to learn Slovene?
Not officially.
Okay.
I mean, I visited a lot. I've picked up vocabulary. I've, as I mentioned, some of the grammatical aspects. I can passively understand a lot. When you were doing the introduction, also because the subject matter is one that I know, me. But there are words that I'll recognize. So yeah, that's also, I mean, a lot of times it's interesting where certain vocabulary is very common across languages. Since I have a basis of having studied Latin and Greek, all of the Greco-Latinate words, so sometimes more technical conversation is easier to understand because we share the words across all of the so many different languages. And
then you just connect the dots, and you get the meaning of the whole sentence, and then
there are often many false friends, and I mean, names is one of the most difficult things for me because names have no syntactic meaning. So if I'm listening, a name, I don't necessarily know that's a name and not a word I don't know, so that's something. Also, I mean, Slovenian conjugates names in a way that neither English nor Spanish does, and so that's tricky for me.
Sometimes for us as well. So.
No, but I mean, it's interesting. There are even words that, so for instance, zmaj is, so we have Cecilia and the dragon, we have Tilken zmaj, but we also have the zmaj of the kite. And so, I know that there are words that have multiple meanings sometimes, but, for someone who doesn't speak Slovenian, I have a fairly, a little bit of understanding subtlety, I guess.
Yeah, true. You said that firstly you're a reader, but then you're also a writer and translator. what are you more, a writer or a translator?
So I think that I always identify as a writer who translates, even though one makes better money usually as a translator, or rather the money is more steady. You know, you write and you don't know if you'll sell it. It may sell then to a publisher, but then it may not sell to an audience. Whereas if you're commissioned to translate something, you know, they're steady work. But also because I'm a reader, very often I fall in love with something and say, I want to help more people read this book. And so there are some books that I'm commissioned to do, but then there's other books that I say, go knocking on doors of publishers and say, I want to translate this book. This book I think is a good for your program for this reason or the other. And so, you know, a lot of the translation, it's part of being a writer, but it's also part of being a reader as much as anything else. So, yeah. So, I mean, they're both integral parts of my identity. So I remember years ago, back when I was still doing commercial translation, which pays better than poetry or literary translation, I had translated like 5,000 words of this institutional gobbledygook. It was what they call GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. Didn't make sense in the original. It didn't make sense in my translation, but that's what. And so, and after I finished a long day of, you know, grueling work like this, I translated 4 or 5 poems just for fun. And some friends of mine were boggled. And they said, how could you translate extra after you've already finished translating? And I was like, I needed to still love language. You know, I couldn't finish my day feeling so dirty with this, you know, it was pure money, but it wasn't, and it was well paid, but it wasn't stuff that actually made any sense. You know, it was badly written original. The translation didn't make sense. It was some just institutional wheel churning sort of thing. And so, you know, I just translated for fun, not for publishing, not for anything, just to make sure that I still fell in love with language again, extra poems. So,
and to go to bed satisfied, probably
exactly.
as well. Yeah. And
exactly.
how does the work of a writer and a translator differ?
It's an interesting question. So translation is very creative, and especially translating children's books is especially creative. You know, you have all of the usual, making sure the voice is there. If there's rhyme, that's an extra thing. But with illustrated books, you also have the pictures. And so you can't, you know, a lot of times we may, you know, my philosophy is to recreate the reading experience. So if something is fun and lively in the original, it needs to be fun and lively in the translation, even if you have to put different jokes or put jokes in different places, or put, you know, if you might have alliteration someplace and that doesn't translate in alliteration, but you can make a different character have alliteration or put it in a different place. So, but, you know, like if in English, if I'm going English to Spanish and it says fat cat, which would be gato gordo, you know, if it was, let's say, crazy cat, sorry, I got confused. If it's crazy cat, that's gato loco. So that doesn't have either rhyme or alliteration. But if I made it gato gordo, fat cat, that has, but if the picture doesn't have a cat, or if it does have, you know, I mean, I could make it loro loco, crazy bird, but if the show's a cat, I have to stay with a cat, you know. So there's all the extra challenges when you're translating illustrated works, because it has to work in the translation, you know, I mean, the translation has to read well for the reader. So you have to preserve as much as possible. Sometimes it requires making more liberties to be more faithful. That makes sense. There was one book I translated into Spanish. So these are indigenous creators. This is a book, Little You, published by a Canadian publisher, Orca, and I translated Spanish. All diminutives in Spanish have gender, but the book is very careful. It shows different indigenous families, sometimes just a mother, sometimes just a father, a mother and a father, just the father, but the babies are never gendered. And in Spanish, this was impossible. It wasn't impossible. I did it, but it was very difficult. So, you know, I mean, I changed the title to You Are You. So from little you to you are you, it seems like a big, I had to make other changes because it's rhyming. It's a very simple rhyming text, but never gendering the baby. So sometimes I had to make more liberties from the original text to recreate that it was gender neutral and rhyming. So even when I took more liberties, I was being more faithful to the original than if I had just used masculine as neutral, which is what Spanish tends to do. But then it wouldn't have been, the author's very careful not to gender the babies being addressed ever. And so, these are things that are fun challenges to me.
Yeah, because in Slovenia it's obvious because it's in the words, so it's quite difficult to not be gender specific. So yeah,
sometimes like if the English line was "you are perfect," so I could say "you are perfection." So instead of saying, that was one way of making it neutral. But other times I had to, obviously also what rhymed in English doesn't rhyme in Spanish. And so you have to pick which word is more important and make a new rhyme. And so, I find this sort of challenge fun and interesting. And, as I said, for me, the important thing is to recreate the reading experience. So if I can recreate in whichever language direction I'm going, that's what's important. I mean, like, when Barbara translated these books, the same thing. These are fun stories. They're rhyming. I told Barbara and all of the translators of these books, I said, take as many liberties as you need to make sure that it's fun and rhyming. You don't have to plot. You can, if you make any changes, that's great.
Yeah, it's just interesting because I was on a presentation of or when Portuguese author, I've told you, José Luis Peixoto was here in Slovenia, and he also explained how he sees the translation, and he said that it's like you would be carrying a glass of water from one country to another, and you go through mountains and valleys, and you just, I don't know, stumble and lose some of the water that you're carrying in this glass, and the rain comes and fills it with the till the top. So when you arrive at the country of destination, then the cup is still full. So yeah, it's the way you said that you just try to get the meaning across, the feelings across, and but otherwise you try to just adapt it to other culture or language, and so, and this is really beautiful, I guess, because yeah, we are all different. I mean, also some meanings are different. Meaning of words are different, so you need to really find something that gets your author's point of view across. So, yeah.
So I mean, when you had asked me earlier about the difference when I write in English and Spanish, so for instance, if I write something set in Spain in English, I explain a lot more of the cultural. I can't just, whereas in Spanish I can just say, for instance, merienda. Merienda, because in Spain we have lunch very late, but we also have dinner very late at night, usually like 9 o'clock. So in the middle of the afternoon, we have an extra meal, a snack called merienda. So in Spanish, I just say, and the kids stopped and had the merienda. But in English, I have to explain what the merienda is, and, because if I am writing, or if it's published in the United States, they've had dinner at 5 o'clock, whereas we don't have the merienda until, let's say, 6. It's after dinner time for them. So you need, when I'm writing in the different languages, if I'm translating, I have to be you're translating the text but also the culture very often, and so or whether it's writing or translation. So it's interesting also. I mean, in English, we say a lot, he said, she said all the time. And in Spanish, we don't need that. We just have a dash for the dialogue and another dash, who's speaking. So a lot of times if I'm translating Spanish into English, I have to add in he said, she said. Otherwise it would read experimental, and that's not experimental, and so in order to recreate the reading experience, I have to add in things or take them out depending which way I'm going, and that's not actually tampering with the text in the translation. That's doing a good translation to recreate the reading experience. So
your work spreads, you said, like through many genres. So you write poetry, fiction, essays, anthologies, and so on, graphic novels. But you're especially known for children's books. What is so special about writing for children?
Children are, I think, the most appreciative readers. Like when parents complain, oh, my child asks for your book every night. That's the best, the best compliment that one can have. I think also, though, that there's a lot of similarities between children's books and poetry, especially different than, let's say, fiction. A lot of fiction these days, books are getting fatter and fatter in fiction, and a lot of stuff is non-essential, if that makes sense. There's a lot of passages that are overwritten that aren't necessary and things like that. And you can't do that in children's books. You can't lose the attention of the reader. And so, I think that children are demanding readers, and it's important to respect the intelligence of children. If you write down to children, they see through you right away. So I deal with a lot of social themes or different things in my work, but it has to be part of the substratum. It can't be the motor of the plot, if that makes sense, because kids catch that right away. And so, if you look at a book like, oops, I don't have Bosporal, something like Read a Book with Me.
Yeah, I have it. I have it here.
I grabbed a different book.
So this is this one? Yeah.
That one. Yeah. For some reason I grabbed the wrong copy. So in that book, for instance, though, there happens to be, for instance, a blind character, but it's not a book about being blind. It's a book about loving reading. It's a book about professions, and it just happens to have a blind character as part of the book. So, a lot of times I will, when I think about a subject that I want to write about, I then think about a way to write about it that includes it as part of the social fabric. We live in the world, and then there's lots of stories where characters can just be part of the structure. So that's my philosophy on how to do a book. Something like Takotrugi is an example.
Yeah.
I had realized that there are books about being adopted, but they're usually about the moment of being adopted. So there are like, there's a book I have, and it's called The Red Blanket, and it's this is the blanket that I wrapped you in and brought you home from the other country. And it's okay, the moment of being adopted, and then those children disappeared. So you don't see adopted children later on. And I said, okay, so I wrote a book about a boy, Kwame, who adopted, but it never says in the book that he's adopted. They're just a family, because what was missing was books that featured adopted kids, but that wasn't about being adopted. In this case, Kwame wants glasses because his brother has glasses, the mother has glasses, the father has glasses, he wants glasses too. So, but it's not, I was adopted or something like that. It's part of the substratum, but it's not the motor of the book.
It's funny that you said it, because in Slovenia we don't have as many adopted children from I don't know, Africa or South America. So we don't usually get to know a lot of people who are, I don't know, different colors, and that is also seen in our picture books. So they are missing from the pictures completely, and you also cannot see I don't know, at least for a few years, until a few years ago, you cannot see, I don't know, chubby children or children with glasses. So all were perfect. And it was really a lack of, I don't know, diversity that diversity, like in a culture, in a society. What's really going on in the real life and what's going on in the books. So the books haven't reflected the society. So I think that now it's slightly getting better and better. So yeah.
I mean, I think it's also important that, you know, I mean, Slovenia is a small country, but is part of, and has a history of being part of larger identities, whether it's former Yugoslavia, whether it's the EU now, you know, and so Slovenian children, even if in Slovenia there may not be, for instance, many people of African descent, Slovenians are part of the EU. They travel, you know, they'll go on Erasmus. They need to be able to be prepared to be in the global plural world that we live in. So even if there may not be many people like that in Slovenia still, it's still vitally important for children to have experience seeing other cultures and other lives and empathizing and recognizing that, oh, you know, these are people like I am and they do things just like me. Otherwise, the ignorance when they finally meet someone will be terrible. You know, I mean, just true. They won't know how to react. They won't know how to live in the global world that we live in. So,
yeah,
I mean, that's
part. Yeah,
you know, like when I was promoting Cecilija and the Dragon to publishers, and I wrote this book back when Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings, there were lots of fantasies with boys, and there were no girls having magical adventures. And I said, well, girls need magical adventures too. And the publishers were like, okay, we like the story, we like the art, but boys won't read books with girls. And I said, well, girls need to have role models too, but it's just as important for boys to be able to see girls having adventures. You know, I mean, if they never see girls having adventures, they don't, you know, that's a lack of inclusion and equality. You know, I mean, they need to, it's as important for boys to see that girls can have adventures as it is for girls to have books that say we can have adventures also. So, but it was interesting. It's the adults who are the ones who don't want the children or are afraid that boys won't read. Because when I was, you know, here in Spain, one of our big holidays is San Jordi. And so San Jordi, 23rd of April, and people give a book and a rose to all of their loved ones. So as a writer, it's a favorite, a great thing. So, but, you know, having a book with St. George defeats the dragon. So, you know, a girl dragon book for when I'm signing this book for San Jordi, it's very popular. And a lot of times, you know, kids would come to the table and, you know, boys would pick up the book because they wanted the dragon. And the parents are like, don't you want like his other book, which has a boy? And they said, no, the dragon. So the dragon was more important than the girl. You know, and the kids don't have the prejudices. You know, to the kids, everything is new. They learn these prejudices from the adults around them who say, oh, that's different, or that's strange, or that's not for you. For whatever reason. So, because I mean, no one ever stops girls from reading boy books.
Yeah.
It's assumed, you know, because we live in a macho culture that, you know, girls have to know boy life and also their life, but boys, because they're in a higher power position, they don't ever learn, you know, it's seen as, oh, that's for girls, that's not for boys. You know, it doesn't work the other way.
Is there any topic that we need to avoid when picking up or reading to children?
I would say that because children live in the world with us, anything that's in the world can be an appropriate topic for a book for children. You just have to write it in a way that is accessible to them. And a lot of times being accessible is not lying to them, is not hiding things from them, is respecting their intelligence. You know, one thing that's actually very interesting, a lot of people think that picture books have very little vocabulary, but actually the early readers have less vocabulary. You know, the first reading books, which look more like adult books, but they're actually, you know, longer pages, but shorter sentences. You know, in a picture book, you can actually have more complex ideas, more complex vocabulary than early reading books, especially because picture books also very often have a dual readership. So you have an adult reading with a child very often, not always, but that's very often the case. It can be parents, it can be a librarian, a teacher. So, you know, you have that double readership. So it's also important, I think, that in the illustrated in picture books, the story, they're not just an illustrated story. That is, that the text and the image go together. So very often, where the zing comes very often is when the text says something, but the illustration says something else. And, you know, there's the visual narrative and then there's the text narrative. And you can create a lot of fun tension that way.
Or that illustration explains a little more just with a picture than you write it in a sentence.
Exactly. So, yeah, I mean, it can be things as simple as, you know, when he makes bread with margarine and the cat has the margarine without the bread. You know what I'm saying? Seeing it, even if it's in the text, seeing it is very different than just, you know, this is a joke that works. It's funny though, because so the original also has the margarine, because in Spanish, margarina, cocina,
margarina,
so kitchen and margarine. But for many countries, before the other problems that the book faced, the margarine was the biggest problem in this book. So in Switzerland, they said, we love the book, we love the translation, but we're Swiss, we cannot have margarine, it must be butter. The French translator just changed it to butter without even thinking, didn't ask, didn't do anything. The Hungarian translator, she did write to us and say, voi, butter, is just V-A-J, it's just one syllable. Margarine is 4 syllables. She said, for my meter, it would be much better for me to use butter rather than margarine. So, and I said, no problem. And actually in English, even though I did a self-translation, there are 4 different editions in English, all of them use butter. You know, the editors, sometimes it's, you know, there's different words where, in some languages it's a stuffy, sometimes it's a teddy, sometimes it's a bear. Each language has its own, each edition has its own variant sometimes, but they all use butter in English too. So, you know, those books. Also with the 2 mothers and the 2 fathers, so like in English, sometimes this is my 2 mums, my 2 moms, mum and ma'am. So like Wales, it was mum and ma'am. So depending on the countries, it's even it's the same language, it's all localized. So
okay, great.
The same even within Spanish. So there are multiple, you know, like in this spread we all chase after the dog. In the Spain version, perro rhymes with gamberro, but gamberro is not used in Latin America. And so in Mexico, in Peru, and in Chile, that rhyme is changed so that it works using other, you know, sometimes. Exactly. But that still rhymes. So sometimes we have to change change the order. You know, the dog got away from us instead of we all chase after the dog, because, you know, depending on what we're going to rhyme. So it's been a fascinating experience. So
I must say, yes. So what should we look at if we are talking about quality children's books? You know, there are so many different books on the market, and some really use just also the illustrations, just basic, that's I don't know, so much computer generated that it doesn't give any feeling, any sub story or side story of to add something to the story. So what should we look at? What is a quality children's book? So I know
there's so much that's involved, and a lot of it, publishing is a business, and so a lot of decisions happen based on economics rather than on quality. Sometimes this is because a book is successful in another country and they say, oh, let's buy the rights because hopefully it'll sell as many copies here. For illustrated books, this happens a lot where the way that books are printed, I can show you with these two. So books are printed yellow, red, blue, and then if you only change the black, you can print, let's say you do 1,000 and 1,000, you could do 2,000 yellow, 2,000 red, 2,000 blue, and then only 1,000 and 1,000 in each language. But then the binding and the manipulation, you do 2,000 units. So very often printing multiple languages at the same time is one way that a lot of publishers are able to bring costs down. And so very often you'll see, certainly in Spain, it's very common to buy American books. And for instance, you'll have books with a yellow and black taxi from New York City. The taxis in Spain have never been yellow and black. But if you ask children to draw a taxi, they'll draw this taxi because they see it so many times in the books, because it's much cheaper for a Spanish publisher to say, okay, give us 2,000 copies and add it on to your 60,000 copies between all the other languages you're doing, then the per unit cost is much less than if they print 2,000 copies on their own original book. And so there's a lot of this sort of imperialism, colonization that happens. The UK, France, and the US are the most aggressive in terms of exporting their work as universal. It's the same with they say that this has a girl, so boys shouldn't read it, but they never say that girls shouldn't read the boy books. So it's like here in Spain and in Slovenia, they think it's a given that we read a book set in New York as universal. But if we had a book set in Ljubljana or here in Madrid, in the US, they'd say, oh, that's foreign, that's not for us. We're expected to swallow their culture as if it's more universal than where we live. So these are economic things, unfortunately. It takes more time and effort to develop local writers and illustrators, and also to work with them. It's much cheaper for a publisher to say, we'll take more of these, but also then they don't have to. Someone's already done the editorial work. So a lot of times the editors themselves are not trained in how to work with an author, to develop the text, to change the text, to alter the text, to make sure that the text and the images leave room for each other. So yeah, it's a difficult question. The whole industry needs to grow up in the country, if that makes sense. And that takes time and resources, and a lot of places don't have that. So Slovenia is a very interesting case because Slovenia has very good support for the translation of Slovenian books to other countries, but not necessarily for the local, how locals can learn how to write better picture books, let's say, or to illustrate. So a lot of it is what Slovenia produces. There's a lot of support to promote it abroad, but not always as much support for how locals can either get better at their own writing or illustrating, or better understand the market, if that makes sense. I've seen a lot of books from Slovenia that could work in Spain but don't necessarily work in English. So in the English market for picture books likes very little text, whereas the Slovenian market has much more text for illustrated books. So and I think that certainly like in Latin America, they like textier, books are expensive. They're not so parents want the value for money. So it's sort of if I'm going to buy a book, it has to have enough words in it. If it has too few, I don't want to buy a book because the books are so expensive, and they say, it has to have value. So, I mean, these are all interesting questions of, how each country's cultural production develops and how much comes from abroad or how much is developed locally or things. I mean, Slovenia is also in a very interesting case where they will be guest country at the Bologna Book Fair. So, I mean, next year, they're the guest 2023, their guest country in Frankfurt, which is all literature. But then in 2024, they're specifically guest at the Bologna Children's Book Fair. Yeah. A real moment for Slovenian children's creators and publishers to be working on stuff, but also to be working on stuff thinking about the local market and the foreign market, and how to make books that work for both. I mean, it's important not to make, I think that there's, in adult writing, you have a lot of this like Scandinavian crime. You have a lot of sort of armchair tourism that happens in these mystery novels that are not written so much for the locals, but for foreigners, and so we want to do that, but you need to also have a balance between these are books that are Slovenian books, but they can also be find echoes or other readers in other places. So I think we got very distracted from the question. I'm sorry.
No, it's nice to see how someone from abroad sees also our book market, so our publishing market. If we just go to the books more that I have here. So in your books, you usually use some simple everyday situations, and you also try to get them some educational and also more engaged point of view. Let's say with no pretentiousness, you also introduce same-sex families. So, and also that you, like we said, with the Cecilija and Dragon, you empower girls, not through power, like physical power, but through wit and knowledge. So maybe also boys can learn from that, so in some way. And you also expose in this the book of so Palladrod, Look Just the Pot. You also expose the knowledge of letting go, so that we are not overthinking past situations, and also the need to be seen, so as we are and how unique we are. And why do you think it's important that authors give us shows us the world from another point of view?
Okay, so sometimes it's another point of view, but sometimes for some books it's their own point of view. So some writers are writing their own stories that are not otherwise being done. But I think though that it's important. Children normalize the absences that they see in our cultural production. So very often, even if there are people in the world around them that they know, if they don't see these people appearing in their books, they learn that certain people are less important than others. And so the absence of certain types of people in the books is very pernicious. I mean, there are some books that are obviously prejudiced, and they say girls can't play football as well as boys. I mean, that's an easy prejudice to recognize. But then there's, and I do this a lot in workshops. I'll ask people, I say, do you know a woman with a tattoo? And are you, or do you know a woman with a tattoo? And normally 100% of the people will raise their hands. And I'll say, when have you seen a woman with a tattoo in a children's picture book? And nobody sees them. So, I mean, this is a case where you have actual lived women's experience, that 100% of the audience will know women with tattoos, which means that the children in their lives also know women with tattoos. But these women are not appearing in the books, and so this is passive misogyny. So, I mean, the active misogyny was very easy to recognize in the book where the boy says girls can't play as well as boys. That's easy to recognize. The more difficult thing is the passive misogyny, where people don't recognize that it's missing, and but that people normalize to those absences. So people see, if they only see women without tattoos, then when they see people with tattoos, they look at them differently, because the women without tattoos are protagonists. They're the mothers in the books. They're the important people because they show up in the books. Whereas, so it's very important for kids to see themselves, but also see other people in the cultural production.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when you show it in a picture book, you like normalize seeing this in your everyday lives.
I mean, rather than normalizing, because it's already normal, I would say stop suppressing.
Okay.
The way that the cis heteropatriarchy suppresses so many different voices, people of other races, various things like that. So it's to stop letting those voices be suppressed is how I try and talk about it, rather than normalizing. They're already normal.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just how we think about things. There's certain things even in our language. I don't know if Slovenian has, but neither English nor Spanish has a word for not being disabled.
Mm-hmm.
That is, it's so taken for granted of being able-bodied that there isn't even a concept. There's not a word for the concept of able-bodied, of not having a disability. And so if we don't even have the language to talk about it, it's one of these blind spots, and so it makes it hard then to talk about things and talk about who's missing and why they're missing, and people don't even recognize very often who's missing.
Yeah, and one of the points, like you said, were also those two books. So when you just show the same sex, so the life in the same sex families, and those two books stirred a lot of negative response in Hungary and Russia in 2021. Because they are banning you and also the publisher just because you're illustrating this same-sex families in it. How did you feel about it?
Obviously, it's terrible to be banned. It's terrible, and this is also where the power of books and the subtle power of books in many cases. I mean, Elena Braslinia, who's the illustrator from Latvia, she and I made these books because there were other books with LGBT characters in them. I even published in Slovenia a book that had LGBT characters in it. But almost all of the books were about being different, overcoming homophobia. And I said, we need to just have books that are fun stories that just happen to have same-sex families in them. And so that's what we decided to create. One is a good morning book and one is a good night book, and all kids wake up and go to bed, and so they're stories that all kids can read. And people are like, you're trying to make our kids LGBT, and it's like, reading these books won't make your children be gay or lesbian, but it will hopefully help them be less homophobic. It was interesting, there was an editorial in Haaretz newspaper in Israel recently, because this book was just published also in Hebrew. I don't have the copy here, but the woman was saying how her daughter and she read this book every night, and some friends were saying, how come you read this book to her when you don't have two moms? She doesn't have two moms. Why are you reading this book to her? And she said, why shouldn't I read this book to her? How come nobody says to me, why you're reading this book with a talking cow? Whereas it's much likelier that her daughter will meet friends or classmates who have two mothers than that she'll meet a talking cow or any cow where, they live in the city in Tel Aviv, the likelihood of her meeting a cow is much less than of meeting lesbian mothers. She's going to have lesbian mothers in her social circle. So, she was saying, how come, it's the homophobia that people are saying, why are you reading this when it's not your family? But, your daughter lives in the world. And so it's important So the backlash against the books was difficult. I was lucky because I don't live in the countries where the backlash was. I don't read Cyrillic, so in order to read the very hateful things said in, especially in Russian, I don't read Hungarian either, but I had to use Google Translate to, see people saying that I, Elena, and the translator should be fusilado, shot, things like that. Mm-hmm. So that was difficult, but it also shows how important it is that books like this exist. These books are now published or forthcoming in 51 different editions in 40 languages. So that shows, yes, there was a lot of backlash. There was also a lot of solidarity and good things with the books, but the scandal gets a lot more attention. So one thing that happened with the books was, as I mentioned, if you print at the same time, it's a way of making it more affordable for a lot of people. So like a lot of times, this is the Slovak, the Polish, and the German edition. There was also the Basque and the Luxembourg. So they all printed at the same time. So there's a lot of nice stories of countries coming together and collaborating together to bring these books to different kids. This in particular was a very nice story where, as a reaction to the backlash, this was published by an NGO in Germany called 100% Mensch, and they worked with an NGO in Poland called Preverite. So they're in Stuttgart and they're in Łódź, and they're sister cities. And so they did a campaign, buy a book, donate a book in the LGBT-free zones in Poland. So, that was a nice positive thing. There are other positive things, the backlash is very famous, but like in Wales, for instance, the NGO Stormil Cymru donated a set in Welsh to all 800 primary schools. So every primary school in the country has a copy. And in Portugal, the books are actually published by I'm translating from the Portuguese, so it's the Commission for Citizenship and Gender Equality. So did the books and gave them out to all the schools. So it was only available free. But again, the actual government, as part of their equality initiative, distributed them throughout the country. So there's lots of nice things, not only the bad things. So I try not to let the haters control the whole dialogue, if that makes sense. Yeah. There are also good stories. So like, for instance, in Hungary, a bookstore was fined by the government for, they were fined 250,000 florins for not warning customers that it had non-traditional families. And they sued the government and won their lawsuit. That was after. So the fine was huge news, but when they won the lawsuit, nobody published the news, nobody celebrated it, unfortunately. So whereas there are other things, the books were published in Slovenia before the scandal happened, and they were just books. They were just books for kids, and some kids like them, some kids don't. The kids themselves usually like them. Some parents don't like them.
It's usually that way. Yeah. Because when I read it just felt so warm. I mean, it's so nice that we have such routines with our kids in the morning, and also this one, so early in the morning. It really, I don't know, how would I say, just empowers those young like boys, for first instance, that they become more independent. Even and this child is in a kindergarten, so he can make himself a breakfast. So isn't it that more important? And also you also get that you also teach the manners. So if others children or members of the family are still sleeping, so you need to be silent and just do your work. So for me, that was much more educational and much more important that there are two moms or two dads. So
I think for kids also, I mean, even if you just look at the covers,
yeah,
the kids care about the cat and the dog. They
yeah,
don't care about the parents. You know what I'm
yeah.
saying? The parents are there, but they're, you know, their stories. Actually, using the Hebrew edition again, so we had to change the margarine and the butter, so it became hummus in Israel. So, and the books are called Hummus in the morning, and the cat's name Hummus, and the dog's name is Fifi, so it's Fifi at night. So Hummus in the morning and Fifi at night. And it was very nice though that my editor in Israel, she was saying she was at a book fair, and a little girl came up and said that they got an orange cat and named it Hummus after the book. So, you know, for her, the only important thing was the cat, you know, not the two mothers.
Yeah.
And she was a girl, so she wasn't even a boy identifying with the protagonist. You know, the only important thing for her was the cat.
Yeah, sure. And we talked about the Cecilia and the dragon. Oh, by the way, where does your fascination with dragons come from? So you just showed 3 books that where dragons are included.
No. Are there 3? There's 2 dragons. There's 3 Zmai, but only 2 dragons because one is a kite.
Okay, yeah.
It's not actually a dragon. And they were 10 years apart. So I do one dragon book every 10 years. So
okay.
I did do a book of a boy unicorn book, but it doesn't. There's a publisher who's interested, but I don't know. We haven't signed the contracts yet. But maybe in 2025. They will publish that one because they have another book coming out first in 2024. So, yeah. But also, I mean, the fantasy, you know, with Cecilia and the Dragon, I wanted not just to flip the paradigm. So it's not just girl saves prince. It creates a new paradigm of girl friendship, you know, and so there are other people who just flip the gender roles. And I didn't want to just do that. You know, I wanted to have to write a story for girls, letting them have fun, magical adventures, which is what, when I wrote this in 2000, I have to look, 2005 is when
okay.
in Spanish originally. So, you know, as I said, there was Harry Potter, there was Lord of the Rings, but there were no girls having magic at the time. And I said, this is missing, you know, we need to have, girls need to have magical adventures too, for themselves and also for boys to see that girls can also have magical adventures. And so
and by that you empower both.
Exactly. So that was why I wanted to do that. And you know, some things are more, this one is more recent, but also this has the message, you know. So this book starts with a boy and his father are going to visit the boy's grandparents or the father's parents. It all depends. The same thing can be different depending on how you look at it. And so that's about learning to not hold on to anger as a way of, you know, looking at things from other perspectives. Is kind of like what you asked, why is it important to read books about other cultures, to not only read the monoculture, and that's so that we learn perspective, that we can see the world. The world is a very diverse and plural world that we live in, and the more we experience it, the better equipped we are to navigate in it and live in it, and treat everybody in it respectfully, and not with prejudice.
If you just we will just have I have just one question. So regarding this book, you said already that it's like about also about the adoption, but actually it also emphasizes our need for uniqueness. So even if, I don't know, we want to be like others so that we will belong somewhere, it's much more important that we need to be unique, to be independent, and then we will get the support from those who love us. So because they will support us or love us as we are. So
This one also, I mean, of all the books, this is a multilingual book, which is interesting because, you know, the book, because it presupposes a multicultural world, you know, having the two languages is part of that. So there's so many different levels that the book is working on in terms of showing how diverse the world is, but hopefully it's a fun story. You know what I'm saying? And so if you don't tell a good story, you can't transmit any message that, you know, you might want to, you know, the important thing is to tell a good story that the kids like. If the kids like the story, then any message that'll be transmitted, but you can't only just send the message, you know, you have to have a story.
Yeah.
And that's the important thing. That's why, you know, as I said, I try and make any message be, you know, you don't just add it on like a spice on top of, it's not like cinnamon on top of a cappuccino or something like that. You know, it has to be from the ground up in the way that the book is conceived.
Yeah.
And to me, these are important because I know we live in a plural and diverse world, and I think that's worth celebrating. And so, you know, I try and make sure that that's reflected in the books that I create. But they have to be fun. You know what I'm saying? It's like these are meant to be just fun books. They're subversive because they're not about being different or overcoming homophobia. You know, and so for a lot of publishers, they're like, oh, we don't know how to publish this. You know, for a publisher like Malinc, it's like, okay, this is a Spanish book. So for them, it came in because it was translated from Spanish into Slovenian. So it's part of their Spanish program, not part of an LGBT program or any other agenda. You know, they published it. It was a fun story that they translated from Spanish as part of their program of translations from Spanish. So, you know, it's a different, and sometimes the books were published in some countries by NGOs, in some countries by publishers. You know, in the Russian publisher, for instance, who was shut down by the state, they were liquidated in April of this year, was an NGO who published the book. The books are published, I can grab a copy. They have a big 18 plus.
Okay.
It was illegal because of the propaganda laws. You can't show anything LGBT for children under 18.
Okay.
So they never sold the book because it's illegal to sell. So you could donate to the NGO and they could give a book to you, but they didn't sell the book. But the state liquidated them. You know, they were an NGO that had been around for 11 years that did many other services. You know, they provided HIV testing and all sorts of other services for the LGBT community. So, you know, the fact that they published the book and were penalized for publishing them, that was the excuse that the government used to shut them down legally, which is
yeah, because we learn through stories from ancient times. I mean, we were telling stories gathered around the fire and just talking about what's going on in our lives, and that was stories, and all those stories just derive from that. I mean, you use just everyday situations. So look, this is what's happening to some kids in the world. So why don't I be so?
This is not pornographic. You know, I mean,
No,
we've seen
yeah.
books. The books are not explicit.
Yeah.
But they're 18 plus. I mean, Hungary is trying to do the same thing of you know, this what they call LGBT propaganda. But the more propaganda is to pretend that we don't exist in the world. You know, I mean, if you have a generation of Hungarian kids and then they turn 18, and then what's going to happen? The government will say, oh, we were lying to you. There's all these homosexuals in the world and we didn't tell you about it. So all they're doing is creating a generation that is unprepared to live in the world that we're in. You know what I mean? When unfortunately there was a shooting at a gay bar in Slovakia, and a woman told me on Instagram, this book had been published in Slovakia a few months earlier, and she said, thank you for publishing this book in my country, because hopefully we will have a generation that's less homophobic, because this is the first children's book like this in Slovakia. And so she recognized how important it is for kids to be able to grow up seeing same-sex families, if they never see them, then they're scary and foreign and unknown. Whereas if they grew up seeing them, it's just part of life, and they get used to it, and it's not threatening in a way that when you pretend they don't exist, or children normalize to those absences, the many different absences, then there's much more hate in the world, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Can we talk some more about reading for the end of our conversation? So you published this book. So are you going to read with me? So in Slovene boš bral knjigo z mano. The book talks about a boy who actually can read already, but he wants to read to someone else or with someone else, so with an adult. Why is it important that we still read to children when they already know how to?
I think that one is he's so proud that he can read, and he needs someone else. He needs to share that with someone else. Mm-hmm. And so, the book, on some level, the book teaches professions, because he asks all the different people in his neighborhood, so he asks the baker, and he says, will you read a book with me? And the baker says, if you help me to knead the dough. And he says, no, my book will get dirty. And he asks the mailman, and he says, if you help me deliver the letters, he says, I'm not allowed to go that far from my house, so it teaches a little bit about professions, but through the people that are, people he knows in his neighborhood. But, what he wants to do is to share his joy and love of reading.
Mm-hmm.
So he's so proud of himself for having learned how to read, that he wants to show off a little bit and to share that he can read. So I don't know if we want to give away the ending, so maybe people take it out from the library.
Sure. But I noticed many times here in also in our country, perhaps it's worldwide a problem or an issue, that when children can start, it was the same with me. So it was like when I learned how to read, and that was very early, then my mother just give the book to me and said, now you can read, just read. So here's the book. And I know that many children, especially here in Slovenia, stop reading when they need to become their own, let's say, amusers or so. How can we extend then this love of reading?
So, this is also something where, as an author, I'm aware of the double readership. So you have to also make sure that you're not boring the adults who are still reading with the kids. So the books have to be fun enough also that the adults like reading them, and that the adults will put up with children asking for the book again and again and again and again. The question you're asking is more of a pedagogical one. So, as an author and a translator, I'm not necessarily the person who can answer it. It's more people who study reading and reading habits, which is different than, I can talk about how to create a book and how to create a book that's fun and entertaining, and why I create books the way that I do, which is different than, how can we do this? As I said also at the beginning, when I talked about my own reading, if children don't have role models of people reading, and people reading as a fun and exciting activity, then that doesn't encourage them to read. So I think one of the ways of getting people to read more, if you had, let's say, campaigns where you have soccer players or football players reading books, that'll show reading as something, people who kids admire doing an activity like that. That's a way of you don't see in the world that we promote, you see families sitting around the television, you don't see them reading. Okay. You don't even see them anymore playing chess together or checkers or Monopoly or anything like that, so
even football.
We've lost a little bit of that, connection in person in our culture, in general. So, which is a shame, you know, I mean, but I think that, you know, having more, treating reading as something valuable as opposed to only something in the margins of our time. You know, like I said, you know, lots of people read only when they're already tired and they're in bed already, or they'll read if they're sitting alone in a restaurant, or while they're commuting, if they're, you know, taking the bus or the train. But, you know, one of the reasons I moved to Spain many years ago, if I said, you know, New York, time is money, and if you're not making money, you're wasting time. So reading is a very subversive act because it's not a lucrative, you know, it's a pleasurable thing, you know, and it's giving yourself permission to enjoy something is against capitalism. But, you know, so in New York, if I said, it's a lovely day, I'm going to go to the park and read my book, in New York, people looked at me strange. And in Madrid, people looked at me jealous. And that was the difference. And so I'm much happier living in Spain, where reading is seen as a more valuable thing, and also where I have the luxury of time to read. That is, you know, New York is so expensive that what one makes in the cultural sector doesn't make it very easy to live in New York. You know, living in a country with socialized medicine makes it much, much better than, you know, in the US, where it's a very difficult situation for people because of the lack of medical coverage. So a job, and so either if you're working, then you're not able to devote yourself to the creative sector sort of thing. So you know, how, you know, read more in public. That's how we can get people to, you know, and kids also need to see their parents reading and other adults reading and enjoying reading. You know, I mean, that's what's missing is, you know, we put a lot of focus on how to get kids to read more, but we need to also say how to get adults to read more, and that'll get kids reading more if kids get to see adults, you know, having fun reading.
Yeah, but nowadays, I know when I was commuting to my job with the train, you only see people who are staring at their phones. So instead of that they will enjoy reading during this time, they were just scrolling through their social media and so on. And how we can revive this passion for books if
Yeah, it's difficult. I'm a big believer in physical books. I love physical books. But as I'm in my 50s now, I've started to read ebooks, and one of the reasons is I can make the text bigger. And so it's also good for, like, when I'm traveling, you know, like I was on my last trip, I was flying to Frankfurt to do an event in Heidelberg, and we were on the plane, and there was a big snowstorm, and the Munich airport got shut, and all of the flights were routed to Frankfurt, and so Frankfurt had no room, so they canceled our flight, so that because there was just no room for us to go, so we had to get off the flight, you know. But we were stuck in the plane for 2 hours without going, you know. But I read 5 books of poetry while we were waiting because I had them on my iPad. So, you know, I mean, it's a way of having a lot of access to a lot of books, you know, without it taking up all of the space that the physical books would have taken. So, you know, I'm kicking and screaming, joining the ebook. Also, I mean, you know, the Slovenia is one place where, you know, Malinc published 3 of my books as ebooks during lockdown, during the early days of the pandemic. So there are 3 books that are only available as ebooks. So, you know, they can be checked out from the libraries, but it's an experiment also to see, you know, if people don't have books available, then no one will start to read on ebooks. You know, it's kind of the chicken and the egg, which came first. You know, if you don't have, you know, you need to have books available in order for people to start reading. So it's kind of, those books I think are to pioneer that in Slovenian there isn't yet habits of reading ebooks, and not necessarily of reading illustrated books, even though kids, you know, they often give the kids the tablet or the phone, you know, where it's the perfect thing where they could read an ebook on instead of playing a game, you know. So some of it may also be that people don't know that the ebooks are available. You know, I think it's something that is still very new for the libraries as well. to say that they have ebooks available for patrons to download, people to buy.
Borrow. We have I don't know, the Biblos. It's a system of ebooks. So if you're a member of public library, you can rent them for 2 weeks for free. So
exactly. So this is I mean, libraries are wonderful, and and there are ways to help people have access to books without going bankrupt. I read a lot of books, and I read a lot of books from the library. So I'm a big fan of libraries. And so, I mean, I started writing because I had read all of the books in my library at school and at the local library. And so I ran out of libraries, so I started writing my own. But, I was a big library user, which is good.
So during your stay in Slovenia, now in November, you also had the opportunity to visit children from different educational backgrounds, so from kindergarten to university. What are your observations? How do you feel about the reading literacy and reading culture here in Slovenia? Did you get some clue about it?
It was interesting, and especially the older the children got, so the very young kids, they all sat in the front row, and they all wanted to be as close, and they were actually the best behaved was the youngest children. And so but they had already read the books, they knew the story, they they had questions, and they were just so happy though to meet someone who made books. As the children got older, they would start sitting from the back, and then like the front rows were empty. As they got to be teenagers, it was interesting because then they started not just being interested in the books, but in fan fiction. And this was something that was interesting, where the social phenomenon of reading, it wasn't just about the books, it was about their interacting and writing their own stories about these characters. So once that happened, then they're interested in books again.
Okay.
So so that was something that was interesting as it went. And I mean, the final event was at the pedagogy, a class of teachers or future teachers. So it was interesting about making sure that in their classrooms they have inclusive books available, not just for all of the children in their class, but all of the children in the world, to make sure they're all represented in the class and not missing by accident or inattention, to learn to pay careful attention to make sure that the selection in the classroom is inclusive.
Did you get a chance also to talk about the importance, how they choose the books?
Yeah, I mean, a little bit, and to, talking about the way that the passive prejudices, and to be aware of their own passive prejudices when they're choosing books for their classrooms. And so, and, not to make assumptions about identities beforehand.
My last question. So we talked about a lot about the importance of reading and how to establish reading routines, and so you gave us some advice about it. But still, what would be the best advice to Slovenian parents and maybe also teachers regarding developing reading as a lifelong value or maybe learning opportunity?
To let kids read fun books or books that they want for fun. I mean, I think that a lot of times I don't know how the educational system works in Slovenia, if there are certain books that are obligatory. And in Spain, this is the problem. And they're supposed to read certain classic books. And they're books that have no relevance to today's life. And there's a lot of time where you might have kids who, if they were allowed to choose comic books or graphic novels, they would read a lot more. but those don't count in the
As a
system.
book.
They're forced to read these classics that, how many times Don Quixote, Don Quixote, it may be valuable in terms of literature, but it's not necessarily a fun book for kids to be reading. They can learn about Don Quixote in history rather than in literature.
Mm-hmm.
Its value is more important for its historical value than its literary value. And so, making sure that kids have access to fun contemporary books is something that I think is very important. One of the books that Malinc has been translating is a very popular, the Futbolissimos, the soccer. These are books that kids love and they want to read. It happened with Geronimo Stilton, the mouse. These are books that, like, for instance, Geronimo Stilton in English doesn't exist, but in Europe, lots of kids all over it, and they all read it and they all want the next one. And it's like a cultural phenomenon. It's not just the books, but there are ways that books became the books that were adequate and appropriate to their experience that they were interested in, and so encouraging kids to read, and letting kids have choice so that they can choose their own books. That's also something that I think is very important. I think that it's less important to prescribe that kids have to read a certain they can only read out of these 10 titles. It's more important that they're reading no matter what they're reading. So, that I think is something, I still read voraciously. And as I mentioned, I read all across genres. So I will read romance novels and I will read science fiction and mysteries and, and that's wonderful. And all of the genres have both good and bad, the same way literature with the capital L has stuff that's well written and stuff that's badly written and stuff that was considered classic. But a lot of times, if you only go with the classics, you're suppressing a lot of voices and experiences because there was a time when nothing else was allowed to be published. So if you're only going to the classics, then you're missing a lot of other voices and experiences, and also the way that certain things were written about. I was just on a jury for the Scottish National Book Award for fiction, and there were some books that were very easy for us to discount, and so reading a book, and in the first chapter, it's a male writer writing a female character, and she's looking at her breasts in the mirror in the first 2 pages, and it was just sort of like such a stereotypical male view of women, and without an understanding, without ever having read anything actually written by a woman of how women move through the world or look at their own bodies. It was an objectification, so it was very easy to say, we don't need to even continue reading this book. This book is not going to win because it's just so stereotypical in how it's written. So, even though it's a book with a female character, it was badly written by a male writer. So instead of letting a woman author write her own experience, you have a male writer badly writing her experience, from a position of arrogance as opposed to from a position. It's not that men can't write women ever. There's certainly men can write good female characters, but they can also do it badly if they do it from this position of arrogance. This is why it's also so important to read, and to read widely. You know what I'm saying? This male author never read stuff that were actually written by women to know how women think and act, and he just assumed that, of course, he knows everything, and it was a bad read.
I can imagine. So, Lawrence Schimela, thank you very much for your time, and we covered a lot of topics during our interview, and I wish you a lot of success and also fun
Voilà.
in the next year. So thank you very much again, and I hope we see each other soon here in Slovenia. So.
Voilà.
Mm.